Hello, warm welcome to the programme. She was there less than 24 hours, but the fallout from Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan looks like it might endure for some time. China is about to begin 3 days of live-fire military exercises barely 12 nautical miles offshore, which Taiwan says amounts to an air and sea blockade. Such was the military response to the Speaker's visit yesterday. The flight that transferred her from Malaysia to Taiwan was forced to take a 3-hour detour around the Philippines. And it remains tense. At one point today, Taiwan scrambled its own fighter jets to ward off those from China that had crossed the Taiwan Strait median line that separates the island from China. While she was on the island, the Speaker spent time with members of the Parliament and the business community. And at her news conference with the President, Tsai Ing-wen, she promised America's continuing ironclad commitment to Taiwan's democracy.
Our solidarity with you is more important than ever as you defend Taiwan and your freedom. We are supporters of the status quo and the rest. We don't want anything to happen to Taiwan by force. So strength, and one of the biggest sources of strength is democracy.
It should be said that other US senators have visited Taiwan this year without stirring such a reaction, but Nancy Pelosi is the third in line, and she's a renowned China hawk, which will not be lost on Beijing. These pictures were taken in September 1991 in Tiananmen Square, where she unfurled a banner in support of those killed during the 1989 protests. Ryan Hass is a senior fellow from the Brookings Institution. He's previously served as the director for China, Taiwan and Mongolia at the National Security Council, advising President Barack Obama and other White House officials. Mr. Hass, you're very welcome to the programme. The US has always maintained a policy of strategic ambiguity when it comes to Taiwan and what its response would be to any invasion of the island. Do you think it still is ambiguous?
Well, another way of thinking about strategic ambiguity is dual deterrence. The idea is basically that the United States wants to stand in the way of and block the two paths that could lead to conflict, either a Taiwan declaration of independence or a Chinese military attack against Taiwan. It's worth recalling that just over a decade ago, the real concern was over Taiwan taking steps in the direction of independence that could have precipitated a war that the United States didn't want. And so there was a feeling that there needs to be a certain degree of ambiguity or flexibility in how the United States responds to different events. Now, of course, today, the concern is that China could take military action against Taiwan, and that has prompted some people to call for a policy of strategic clarity, to declare clearly that the United States would intervene militarily in the event of a conflict. Practically speaking, though, the only way to do that would be through a mutual defense treaty between the United States and Taiwan, which would require the United States to basically abandon its relationship with China. So, barring a dramatic provocation from China with the military dimension, I expect that the Biden administration will continue to coolly, calmly maintain its long-standing positions.
Yeah, as you suggest, things have to change because Taiwan has changed beyond all recognition. And I suppose the question for Congress is how much of that new reality, Taiwan as this confident democracy with a free press, a thriving economy, do they recognise, and how much do they try and maintain the status quo? It's a very fine balance.
It is. But the people of Taiwan are very pragmatic. I think that they value their autonomy. I think they value their democratic way of life. And many Americans are committed to supporting Taiwan and protecting and preserving the status quo as it currently exists.
So what about China's response? Is this just saber rattling, or is it more than that?
Well, I think that we are, in the midst of a pretty significant escalation. It's safe to say that tensions are higher now than they have been arguably since 1995 and 96, which is the last time that there was a cross-strait crisis. And I expect that China's responses will take place over the coming days, weeks, and perhaps months. The last cross-strait crisis lasted 8 months, just as a point of reference. And I think that we should probably expect to see a military dimension, a cyber dimension, an economic dimension, an informational dimension. The Chinese want to try to show the people of Taiwan that there are costs and consequences for being close to the United States and not working with China. I think that they want to demonstrate the United States being impotent and being able to shield Taiwan from this pressure. And of course, they want to show their own people at home that they are reacting strongly and toughly to Taiwan's actions and U.S. support for them. Yeah. Now, at the same time, I don't think that the United States is looking to turn this into a test of wills. that leads to runaway escalation. I don't think it's really in China's interest to allow there to be runaway escalation either. And so we will need to watch this space, but I think there are a few signposts that we can probably pay attention to. One is if the United States and China continue to talk to each other. Thus far, there are indications that that channels remain open for the two of them to be in discussions with each other. China's ambassador has not been recalled from Washington, for example, which happened during the last Taiwan Strait crisis in 1995-96. We'll have to watch to see if there's any meaningful conversation between the Secretary of State of the United States and the Foreign Minister of China, who are both attending a similar conference this weekend in Cambodia. And also if there are preparations in place for the two leaders, Joe Biden and Xi Jinping, to see each other on the margins of multilateral events this November in Asia. I think those data points will give us a bit of a directional signpost as to the trajectory that this relationship is headed down.
Yeah, plenty of signposts coming up, which are important. Mr. Haas, stay with us because I want to explain to people why Taiwan fits into the bigger global picture. We all know that its location prevents China from claiming complete control over the South China Sea, but it's not just strategically important. It also plays a vital role in the global economy because Taiwan makes around half the microchips that we use, those that you'd find in your mobile phones, your car, or indeed the high-tech weaponry that the West is developing. Its next nearest rival, South Korea, makes 17%, the US barely 10%. But when it comes to the most advanced semiconductors, there's just one Taiwanese company, TSMC, that makes more than 90% of the entire global supply. Now, you might have read that the United States has begun trying to solve that problem. Joe Biden is about to sign into law a bipartisan bill Congress passed just last week called the CHIPS and Science Act, which will provide tens of billions of dollars to companies developing semiconductors. Let's bring in then Emily Taylor. She is the CEO of Oxford Information Labs. She's also with Chatham House. She is the editor of the Journal of Cyber Policy and she's in Oxford for us. Welcome to the programme. Talk to me about Taiwan's role with semiconductors. If there was to be an embargo, if China was to block the air and the sea exports from Taiwan, what would that mean for the global economy?
It would have a really significant adverse effect. As you've just described, Taiwan plays an incredibly important role in the global semiconductor market, with particularly over 90% of those advanced chips essential for emerging technologies, but also around half of the chips that are in pretty much everything today. It's actually harder to find things that aren't computerized these days compared to things that are computerized. And we've seen over the last year that as a result of the pandemic and sanctions and also adverse weather conditions, there's been a global shortage of semiconductors. But a shock effect like an embargo or some other event like that affecting Taiwan would have an even more severe impact on the supply of semiconductor chips.
And in some respects, we've already experienced that, haven't we, through the pandemic, what a blockade of Taiwan might look like. Are we doing enough, do you think? I mean, we've talked about the CHIPS Act that's just been passed in the United States, but are we doing enough, generally speaking, in the West to mitigate the threat?
Well, this is a truly global supply chain. So there are a lot of very specialist functions in semiconductors that have leading players in the West. But the manufacturing, we are behind, as you said in your piece just now, 10% in the US, 17% in Korea. And the UK's only chip foundry was recently sold to a Chinese-owned company. So more or less at the time where we were deciding to rip out Huawei 5G equipment, this takeover just happened. So I think there is a strategic, there's an awareness of the strategic importance of sovereign capabilities here, but it's not that easy. This is an incredibly specialist and difficult to create sort of specialism. And so you can't just decide it one day and then have all these foundries the next day. You just saw last year, you mentioned, the effect of climate change on chip manufacturing in Texas when there was snow and power outages. It took months for those foundries to come back online. And that shows how much of a time lag there will be between making a decision and finding the necessary money to invest on day one. It's going to be months and years before we see that return.
But if it is such a strategic issue, so important to countries as plainly it is, and we've just witnessed that, why do we not just move Taiwanese companies to America or to the UK? Why do we not share around the expertise?
Well, again, I think it partly there are moves, and you could see in Nancy Pelosi's statement today that she's talking not just about the investment in the United States, but also the opportunities that will mean for the Taiwanese manufacturing capabilities. But these are very difficult things to build. These are tiny little components, much less large than a speck of dust. You have to have dust-free environments, toxic gases, and so on. So is not impossible, of course, but I think partly, what we've seen with Taiwan is network effects, that they've been very strong in this area, and therefore they've drawn in investment and further expertise and been a hub for that.
Amanda Renteria, as the world reorders, it's not just chips, is it? I remember just recently France talking about healthcare, for instance. 80% of Europe's raw materials for the active agents in some of our drugs come from China and Asia. Do you think that actually parliaments in the West are having to rethink what China's reaction is going to be to some of these global events and where we source some of our most strategic things?
Absolutely. And this has been a conversation on semiconductor manufacturing for a long time, but it has certainly increased given geopolitics, given the sentiment around. That chip bill, the chip bill that passed in the United States, has been talked about for more than a decade, that we needed to have manufacturing in the United States. But now we're at a level where not only have we been behind for a significant period of time, but there's real concern about the Chinese-Taiwanese relationships. I remember being there in 2009 when Pelosi had visited with the Dalai Lama, and all the stations, the minute it had Speaker Pelosi on the TV, it went black. So this has been an ongoing relationship with her. No one's surprised about that. But what I do think it really speaks to is we are a moment now where we can't wait to start building more diverse capacity on semiconductors. It is true, the pandemic has really highlighted this reality, this gap that America has. And so it was as important not only to say we are still with you, Taiwan, but in order to start to build out semiconductors here, understand manufacturing, how can we go up that learning curve faster? The relationship with Taiwan will be absolutely imperative to being able to do that in the States.
Yeah, but while we're not there, Ron, that strategic relationship with China, albeit that it's at a very low point at the moment, is crucially important. And in fact, Joe Biden spent 2.5 hours just last week trying to keep the channels of communication open, which is why the White House were slightly restrained, let's put it that way, in giving their support to Nancy Pelosi and her visit.
Good evening to you, Christian. Absolutely. And I think this is one area that Republicans, Democrats, Americans stand united behind the Speaker of the House going over to Taiwan, recognizing the geostrategic importance of that island. And as Amanda just mentioned earlier, this is something where I think that we've been behind the curve. For she and I both being from Northern California, from being from a part of the country that has a semiconductor manufacturing base, but recognizing this is something that this should have been taken care of years ago. The Biden administration, I believe, Christian, had an opportunity to really say to China, you can't dictate to us. And your previous guest said a test of wills. You can't dictate to us which U.S. officials can and cannot come to China. And I think that they tried to be a little bit too cute by half of not seeking to upset the Chinese government. But at the same time, I think we could have sent a stronger message by saying, we will go where democracy is, and you can't tell us where that stops.
We will have to leave it there. Ryan Hass, Emily Taylor, thank you very much for joining us this evening and sharing your expertise. Thank you very much.